We are in the second week of this series on Psalm 139. We're also in a strange cultural moment right now. I like to read the different articles that come out talking about how life is different now, what life's going to look like next year. I don't know that I always agree with what everyone says, but one of the things that is true across the board is that we are right now entering into a baby bust. A baby bust. And there is some suggestion that someday soon we'll hit a baby boom. But right now in COVID-19's era, birth rates are down, pregnancies are down, and we will be hitting next month, just like in a couple days, we'll hit December, and we'll hit this 9-month period since the pandemic started. So the first COVID babies are coming. And guess what? They don't want to hear that they're COVID babies. But that's what they'll be remembered for. Being born, being conceived during this period. One of the reasons we know that birth rates are down is because they can register this with prenatal doctor visits. They can register this or guess this based on Google searches about pregnancies. And so estimates say between 300,000 to 500,000 less babies will be born this year than in a normal year. Google searches for pregnancy tips and how to make sure that you're taking care of your body and your baby are down 10 to 15% in the past 9 months. Now, there was a tsunami that hit Indonesia many years ago, and right after the tsunami, there was a baby bust, but within 2 years, there was a baby boom. And so some are predicting that there will be a baby boom maybe in 2022. When the vaccine's out, when the economy rebounds, when kids are back in school and we're not tired of being around them all the time, we're like, hey, maybe we should have some more. I don't know, but that's a suggestion. Now, here's a deeper question. Here's a deeper question. What is a baby? This is a deep cultural question. And culture looks at the mass that's forming inside of a woman and is afraid to call it a person. They like to call it a human being. Yeah, it's alive. But to call it a person, that assumes that there's some higher form of life going on there. This came out in an article this past week on The Atlantic. In the cold scientific realm of biology, reproduction begins with a random genetic shuffling, an act of fate. If you were to be less cold, more poetic. The 23 pairs of chromosomes in our cells line up so that the DNA we inherited from our mother and father can be remixed and divided into sets of 23 single chromosomes. Each egg of sperm gets one such set. What is a baby? According to the cold logic of science, it is a collection of DNA that a sperm and an egg mixed together that's going to kind of look like mom and kind of act like dad. Scary thought, right? What is a baby? They go on to say that the body has been reduced according to the way that culture describes the beginning points of life. The body has been reduced to the subpersonal, functioning solely on the level of biology and chemistry. Human life has been reduced to raw material with no intrinsic purpose or dignity, subject to whatever purposes we choose to impose. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the debates in our culture that get at when does life actually begin? Human life. When does a person become a person? That's actually the question that people are debating in courts and asking in coffee shops. It's a tough question. When does a person become a person? But here's what's happening. Folks are tiering person as this thing up here that happens at some arbitrary point when the baby starts to think, when the baby's outside the womb, when the baby can fend for itself. That's when it becomes a person. And then a human being is as soon as the egg and the sperm are together or maybe implanted. So human life, people will concede, begins very early on at conception. But a person becomes a person when? And then there's an arbitrary marker. And this is a really tough, tricky, difficult question. Now, I want to suggest that Psalm 139 helps us think through this question, but I also want to remind us that Psalm 139 is not given to us to be a proof text on how to handle the abortion debate. It's poetry. And so it gives us a sense of God valuing life, but remember, it's a poet's understanding of life. And so we have to come to this psalm and think about this. But I do want to come back to one other thing before I move on from this beginning. Right now, we've talked about 300 to 500,000 less babies in 2021 after COVID. But I did a little search. I get something in the mail from Focus on the Family, and they said that 3,000 babies are aborted every day. 3,000 babies are aborted every day. I think Focus on the Family's number is a little high. So then I went to a more liberal standard, Planned Parenthood, and I wondered, what do they say is the abortion rate per year? They're a little low. They say it's 600,000 babies a year that are aborted, okay? So somewhere in the 700,000 a year number, that's how many babies are aborted in the United States every year. COVID-19 has taken 263,000 lives. Abortion has killed many, many, many more people this year. But the only time we talk about abortion is when the election comes up and we want the right person in office. And this is decimating lives, human lives, persons created in the image of God, fearfully and wonderfully made. Now let's span out globally what's going on. Well, 39 million lives every year through abortion. 1.43 million through COVID. Again, keeping things in perspective. Every death is tragic. There are a lot of lives taken through abortion. If you go to the abortion counter and watch these numbers tick, I just watched it for about 30 seconds, and I saw the number go up in multiples of 10. This is tragic. This is horrible. This is rough. So you take a baby bust because of COVID, and then you take this national and global trend for abortion, and you have a lot of babies who are not being born, who are fearfully and wonderfully made, bearers of the image of God. And guess what? We have 3 people in our church right now who have babies in their womb. So our church is not joining the bust. We got a little bit of a boom. That's always good news for a church to have a full nursery. The nursery will open in 2021, someday. So let's look at Psalm 139, the next couple of verses. We have 6 verses we're going to look at, but just a reminder. This is not a proof text about how to handle abortion, but it does speak to life and bearing God's image and the beauty of the gift of life that God gave us. In the first 12 verses, we opened up with God being inescapable. He knows every thought that we've had. He knows every word that's come out of our mouth or that we restrain from coming out of our mouth. And at the beginning, the psalmist said, "This is wonderful." But he meant it like, "This is awful." And this poem is sort of a lament. Remember, Hebrew poetry, we talked about, uses lots of parallelism. Hebrew poetry uses lots of metaphors. It uses something called merism, where you have day and night, and it just means the whole span of time. And so we want to remember those rules of reading as we look at Psalm 139, just verses 13 through 18. And the psalmist says, "For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I were to count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you. So we're going to look at 3 different sections to this psalm. The way that this psalm plays out is there are 4 sections of 6 verses each, and each section opens up with a 1-verse summary, and then an explanation, and then a conclusion. And so we're going to follow that same logic. And this is the opening verse. For you formed me, my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. Remember, this is poetry. So inward parts is a very broad term. Technically, he's talking about how God formed his liver. Now, God formed more than our liver, but that's the inward part that he's talking about. The word formed is one of many creation words that's used here in this psalm. And then it says he knitted. It's not like God was up in heaven and he had a needle and your veins were threads or your intestines and he was weaving you together. This is poetic language talking about how God supervened over your creation. He created a way for babies to be knit in their mother's wombs. And he's not here envisioning test tube babies. Now, God's not against science. He's not against us using science for the best medical practices, even in birthing. But here he's saying, I partner with the mom in the creation of the baby. He did that with Mary. Typically, he partners with the mom and the dad in the creation of a baby. I formed you in my inward parts. And this is intimately connected to the previous section. God, you are inescapable. And I'm okay with that, the psalmist says. And then he says, for you formed my inward parts. Not only are you inescapable, but you know me more intimately before I was ever birthed into this world, and you'll know me until my last breath on this planet. Because you know me so intimately, because you're inescapable, because you're all-powerful, I'm going to rest in this fact. And the psalmist has come to rest in this fact. So you formed my inward parts, my liver and everything else, knitted me together in my mother's womb. There's a partnership. There's a plan, there's a process that God supervened over. Life is conceived here. In fact, when God uses, or the psalmist uses terms like you knitted me together, and he's going to use woven later, we're talking about actually, you know how ladies in the church sometimes when they're multitasking and listening to me preach, they're knitting hats and scarves and mittens. God uses that same sort of artistic tapestry to create human beings. And so one commentator says the human body is a work of art. Look down at yourself right now. Maybe your navel, maybe your shoes, maybe your toes. Wiggle your fingers in front of you. You can do this online too. Say, I am a work of art. Now say it. I'm a work of art. Now I know you look at yourself in the mirror sometimes or a picture of yourself and you look at that one glaring fault and you don't like it. But no. That's not what God says about you. I am a work of art. You are a work of art. Because God created you as such. So God conceived the miracle of birth, and the psalmist here is recognizing it all starts with God. The process started with God. The beauty started with God. Birth was a miracle. God conceived the miracle of birth. It's really interesting what Nancy Pearcey says in some of her research. She writes about how we should celebrate the body. The body is not something to be disparaged, something that we should hate. The body is something that we should appreciate and take care of and celebrate. And so in her research on the body, she said, scientists recently discovered that when a sperm meets an egg, an explosion of tiny sparks erupts from the egg at the exact moment of conception. Human life literally begins in a bright flash of light. I don't know what camera caught that, but that sounds amazing. So moms and dads, next time your kids say, where do babies come from? Say, God made a brilliant flash of light and you were there. If you don't want to get into the whole birds and bees talk. But this is what scientists have discovered. And it's not just this brilliant beginning and God conceived this miracle of birth, but even the way that the DNA all lines up for us as human beings to have such similar features, but such distinct identities as human beings. The newly fertilized egg contains a staggering amount of genetic information, sufficient to control the individual's growth and development for his entire lifetime. A single thread of DNA from a human cell contains information equivalent to a library of 1,000 volumes. Today, we know the human genome has up to 3 billion base pairs of DNA that influences the expression of traits in the individual cell. We're all made up of all of these individual cells with all this really, really complex DNA, and just the information of it would fill a library. I heard a guy talk on a TED Talk one time. If you just took the genetic information that each of us have and put it on gigabyte thumb drives, you would fill up the Titanic with your genetic information. And that's something God made. Wow. And it starts with birth. God conceived this miracle of birth, the fact that he could arrange all these things together. Philip Yancey wrote a book some time ago called, you might need to click back there for me. Philip Yancey wrote a book with Paul Brand some years ago called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. Paul Brand was a doctor who worked with people battling leprosy. And he looked under the microscope and saw the complex wonders of God's creation. And so Yancey interviews Brand, and they write this book together about how complex we are as human beings. And it's a beautiful book, and they say this: the key to ranking human worth is specialization, the process of all these cells in us taking turns, dividing up labor, limiting their responses to a single task. So not only are we wonderfully complex with all the genetic information in us, but all these cells know what to do. The cells inside you, the white blood cells, they fight disease. The neurons travel this pathway so that we can make decisions and then our bodies function. Everything kind of works together but does their task. And so one cell by itself is very complex, but then you have this reproductive process that God put together, a sperm and an egg and a flash of light and all the DNA. Wow, that's wonderful. You have our brains and the way that they work, and the way that our brains store information, and the way that our brains have these pathways that they develop, and the way that our brains can make our bodies work together. This is all part of the specialization. If you just look at the human eye, and Yancey talks about this in his book, all the rods and the cones that are in our eye, and we take in things like upside down or backwards, but then it communicates with our brains so that we can make sense of our world visually. And as soon as you hit my age, 41, and you're trying to read paper from this far away, you start to get dizzy, and you know your faculties are starting to betray you. You're like, wow, they used to be fearfully and wonderfully made. Now I'm just decaying. But God had designed this from birth to work so well. You think about the liver. And you think about how sad it is when your liver starts to give out and you have to go in for these treatments because your body is starting to fail you. You think about our lungs, and right now we're so concerned about breathing the wrong kind of aerosol or getting fluid on our lungs, and that's so tragic when that kind of stuff happens. But these lungs that help us breathe in air and release air, and how in these capillaries it turns from oxygen to carbon dioxide. I mean, this is like crazy stuff that God himself put together. Specialization. You think about the hammies. The hammies back there, and if you haven't stretched for a while and you do some squats and then the next day you're sore there and you're sore there, we should exercise these bodies, because when we don't and then we do something vigorous, they tell us, you should have been exercising more. And they communicate that way. I mean, our body is this powerful, complex machine that God has put together where all the different elements specialize but work together. Now, Yancey also says this: it's not just about how all the different cells and organs in our bodies are specialized, and this is something that starts from birth, but he says that there's this ecstasy of community when our body works together. So anybody here, and you can say this online too in the comment feed if you're going along that way, anybody overeat at all this Thanksgiving? Just put your hand up in the air. Okay, but it started with good intentions, right? And that first taste of whatever dessert you were really looking forward to, and it hit your tongue, and it made your eyes wide, and your brain went off, and your body is working together. That's the ecstasy of community, how all these different things function. But then by the end of Thanksgiving, like your stomach feels bloated, and you're starting to get really tired, and the ecstasy of community is saying, take a nap, right? And then you lay down, and this ability to fall asleep where your body just relaxes, and then you get that foot twitch, ecstasy of community. God designed our bodies to work together this way. And this all starts with conception, this birth miracle. Over 9 months, these cells divide up, functions in exquisite ways. Billions of blood cells appear, millions of rods and cones. In all, up to 100 million cells form a single fertilized ovum, and finally a baby's born, glistening with liquid. Already his cells are cooperating, his muscles limber, up in jerky, awkward movements. His face recoils from the harsh light and dry air of the new environment. His lungs and vocal cords join in a first air-gulping yell. And that's what happens when the doctor pulls the baby up and says, it's your child, it's a boy. And it cries, it breathes its first breath. The crying baby is a delightful sound at first, and then not so much. And this author goes on to say, within that clay-colored, wrinkled package of cells lies the miracle of the ecstasy of community. His life will include the joy of seeing his mother's approval at his first clumsy words, the discovery of his own unique talents and gifts, the fulfillment of sharing with other humans. He is many cells, but he is one organism. All of his 100 trillion cells know that. And this all begins with the miracle of birth that God himself came up with. If you think about what happens when the egg and the sperm come together and this life is conceived, you can see that from the very beginning, this miracle of birth was a magical, beautiful, miraculous process. 5 to 9 days, implantation. 18 to 20 days, eyes are developing, hearts pumping blood. 28 days, arms and legs are budding. 30 days, brain is developing and active. 35 days, facial features are forming. 40 days, heart heard by an ultrasound. And if you've ever had a chance to hear that first ultrasound, it's so amazing. It sounds like an army's marching. It is. It's an army of cells that God has put to work inside the mother's womb. 42 days, skeleton formed. 45 days, all internal organs are developing. 8 to 9 weeks, hands and feet almost fully formed with fingernails, and they're moving. 10 to 11 weeks, the baby is squinting, it swallows, it makes facial expressions. It winces when it hears its first dad joke. And at 12 to 13 weeks, it's kicking, it's turning, it's punching, it's grabbing. At the end of the first trimester, a baby is like a 2-year-old boy. You get that? It's kicking, it's turning, it's punching, it's grabbing. Because birth is a miracle that God has put together. God conceived the miracle of birth. Everything intrinsic to a human is present from fertilization, Nancy Pearcey says. No outside force or substance enters into the embryo at any point to transform it from some other creature into a human. The entire human being develops in a seamless continuum from conception. This is why Christians are pro-life. They see that God has authored, he has conceived the miracle of birth that is bringing new image bearers into the world. God conceived the miracle of birth. Think about this. My mom was in a movie theater watching Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which I think is a movie about magic, with my 2 older brothers, when little Timmy said it's time to come out. That's me, by the way. I can envision my mom going into the movie theater. My mom had this gigantic purse, big enough for either of her children to fit in, and it was stuffed with bags of popcorn and Ziploc bags and a couple cans of Coke, probably a Diet Coke and a Sprite. And they all sit down, and my mom starts distributing the contraband food in the movie theater, and then you hear this, and everybody knows that my mom's water just broke. No, that was the sound of a pop. That was a terrible joke. And so then my mom in the movie theater is like, it's time to go. So they leave the movie. I don't know if my brothers ever saw the end of, Scott, if you're watching, did you ever see the end of Bedknobs and Broomsticks? But that's my conception story. I mean, that's my birth story. That's when I first came into this world and breathed my first gulp of this air. 9 months before, though, I was alive. I think about Margot. She just turned 13 this year. We have 3 teenagers in our house. And she was supposed to be a natural birth at Liz's parents' house. And we tried, and we tried, and we tried, and we tried. We tried all sorts of weird stuff that I won't dare tell to get this baby to come out, but Margot didn't want to come out. So we eventually had to go to the hospital and get a C-section. And the doctor says, it's a good thing you did, because there was internal bruising that was going to turn into internal bleeding that was going to be tragic for both parties. The miracle of birth isn't always a happy miracle. It's tough, too, because life is fragile. Think about my neighbor. People try to have, people have baby showers, right? Someone's going to have a baby, so you have a baby shower, you get all these gifts. My neighbor actually had a shower baby, which is different. It's when you actually had your baby come out in the shower. I mean, the miracle of birth. You never know when it's going to happen. It doesn't always follow your plans, but it's something that God conceived of. And it's tough because of the curse, but it's beautiful because we bear God's image. And the psalmist recognizes that. And the psalmist says, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. I praise you when he thinks about this. He goes straight into praise. I praise you. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. He starts by praising God for the miracle of birth, but then he expands beyond all of that. And he says, everything you've created, God, is beautiful. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you. The frame there means my skeleton. It wasn't hidden from you when I was being made in secret. It's not a secret to God. Remember last week we said God sees everything. He's inescapable. It's a secret to everybody else what's going on. Intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Now here's where we get at poetic language again. Babies are not born underground. But there are certain things that we could not see before ultrasounds and x-rays. And it's how that child is developing in the womb. And so what the psalmist does here is he takes, in his age, what looks like something that's unseeable, life formed underground, and he applies that to the womb. But now we know we can see what's going on in the womb with ultrasound and other technologies. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. But we know by 13 weeks, the baby starts to take, it's taken full shape. In your book were written every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. And now the psalmist is transitioning. He's not just talking about the miracle of birth, but he's talking about the limitations of life. The fact that all of us have an end point too. And this is a reality that we've been so aware of in the past 9 months. God determines the days of our lives. You may not know the last day that you're going to live on this earth, but God knows that. He knows when you were conceived. He knows when the doctor is going to say, breathed his last breath, died on this day at this hour. God determines the days of our lives. One of our elders, Art Bushin, tells me that he has his whole funeral planned. And he reminded me of that again recently, just in the past month. Do you want my list of songs? But I had a conversation with Art about 2 or 3 months ago when we were making plans for small group relaunches. It's like, can we really plan something like relaunching small groups right now? We don't know what the late fall, what the winter's going to be like. And it's hard to plan things right now. So Art spends his time, I guess, planning his funeral. I don't know. Does it sound morbid? No, it's not, actually. It's a really beautiful thing. Because Art realizes, as he's reflected on Psalm 90, but even this psalm here, which talks about the book of life, a theme in Psalm 68 and Philippians 4, the book of life, that God knows when our days will end. And we shouldn't take any day for granted. This is the day that the Lord has made. We should rejoice and be glad in it. And when we understand that there is a limit to this life, we can rest in the fact that God has control of those things. He's the author of life. He should have authority over me. I don't have to fret over the fact that I'm going to die. We're all going to die. We are. And so I appreciate that Art just says, God's numbered my days. God's numbered my days. God's numbered your days, and your days, and your days, and your days, and your days, my days. That's not a threat. That's a promise that he's got everything under control, and he cares for you. Now, there are people who want more control. I think this lady's a little bit loony, and I can't remember her full name. It's Katie something from Great Britain. She thinks that euthanasia vans should be something that become far more common in Great Britain. You just drive them up to old people's houses especially, and they can walk in there, and that can be the end. They can determine the end of their lives. Euthanasia vans. They actually kind of practice this, I think, in Finland or something like that, but she thinks it should come to Great Britain. She goes, we can determine to end the life of our pets. We should be able to determine the end of the life for human beings too. I think that's a little crazy. I think that's a little sick, and I think that takes away control over God. God determines the days of our lives. But I want to tell you that in the past 9 months, every time you turn on the news and hear that Kosciuszko County or Indiana or Ohio or the United States of America has reached a new benchmark in COVID cases and deaths, and the death toll is rising, you can't help but feel a little bit threatened or crazy or anxious or stressed. We're not watching the death count for cancer. It's killing people. We're not watching the death count for abortions. It's killing people. We're not watching the death count for car accidents, but they used to post that when you drive in Chicago. It is not healthy to every day think about the death count of one particular disease. So stop it. God has determined the number of our days. So just turn the death count off. It's going to happen to all of us. It's going to happen to all of us. But God has determined that days. I'm not saying don't be wise. I'm not saying don't be cautious. I'm just saying quit, watch the ticking counter. It's horrible. Here's how the psalmist concludes this section. How precious are your thoughts of me, precious like gold, precious like a diamond. Your thoughts. It's not just, oh, God thought of me, like he was looking around and he saw me there and he's like, nice shirt. He's like, the word thought here is intention. Your plans, your desire and will for me. How precious are your intentions for me, O God. How vast is the sums. And if you want to know how big that is, here's what the psalmist does. He doesn't just say sum, he says sums, plural. How vast are the sums of the sums of the sums of the sums of your thoughts of me. If I could count them, they would be like the sand on the seashore. I think in 1 cubic foot of a beach, you have 1 million grains of sand. So just take one beach in Destin, Florida. And God's intentions for you, which are good, are more numerous than that. This is crazy. But God intends good for every image bearer. God intends good for every image bearer. The psalmist captured that. God intends good for me. God intends good for you. God intends good for you. And God intends good for every image bearer. And life begins at conception. So every life and the miracle of birth, and every life that has an end to its days, God says, I intend good for you. Well, how do we experience this? First of all, the reason this is true is because we bear God's image. Because we bear God's image, there is something special about us as humans. I like what C.S. Lewis wrote about this. He said that everything God has made has some likeness to himself. So you can look around creation and you can see glimpses of God in everything you look at. He says space is like God in its hugeness. Matter is like God in the fact that it has energy. The vegetable world is like God because it's alive. Animals are like God because they have unceasing activity and they're creative and distinct. But we are higher mammals. Oh, and the higher mammals have instinctive affection if you watch the way they care for their creatures, their sons and daughters. But then he says, but when we come to man, the highest of the animals, we get the completest resemblance of God which we know of. Man not only lives, but loves and reasons. Biological life reaches its highest known level in God. This world is a great sculptor's shop. We are the statues. And there is a rumor going round the shop that some of us are someday going to come alive. I love what C.S. Lewis says there. Everything in creation reflects God in some way, but only we as humans bear God's image. That means we have a special place in creation, a special responsibility in creation to rule and subdue, to be fruitful and multiply. But it also means that we have a special relationship with God that nothing else in creation has. Every human being bears God's image. And so God wants intimacy with every human being. But not every human being realizes that they're created in his image. And so a starting point for knowing that God intends good for every image bearer is just acknowledge that all human beings are image bearers, and therefore all human beings deserve dignity. And human beings are very strange creatures. The way we identify ourselves these days, the way that we present ourselves these days, some of the things that we try to hide or get rid of as human beings, very interesting. This author here says, dignity for all people is a public good. The incarnation elevates the status of every human being everywhere on the planet at any time in human history. It elevates the work of every human being at every stage of their lives because the arc of Jesus' own life included every stage of existence, including resurrection, which was his human destiny. But babies, Jesus was a baby. Jesus never got old, per se, but the elderly matter to Jesus. The sick matter to Jesus. The religious people matter to Jesus. Sinners mattered to Jesus. The disabled mattered to Jesus. Men mattered to Jesus. Women mattered to Jesus. Ethnic minorities mattered to Jesus. There's dignity for all people because people of all stripes and shades and colors and backgrounds bear the image of God. And so granting them dignity is a public good. The Atlantic had an interesting cover article this past month about how there is the disappearance of Down syndrome in certain countries. Like less than 20 kids are being born with Down syndrome in certain countries in Europe because they can do the testing and they can find out whether or not they have that extra chromosome, and the majority of those parents will abort that baby. There's a small minority who choose to keep the baby because they think it might be a false positive, and then some actually got a false negative and had babies with Down syndrome. And so this article was a really thoughtful, balanced article. It talks about how even children with Down syndrome bear the image of God. Now, they didn't say it that way, but that's what I was reading into it. Here's what they said in the article. As they interviewed lots of parents and talked about the diversity that they saw in these kids compared to other kids around them in their same life stage. The article says, as genetic testing has become more widespread, it's revealed just how many other genetic anomalies many of us live with. Not only extra or missing chromosomes, but whole chunks of chromosomes getting deleted, chunks duplicated, chunks stuck into a different chromosome altogether. Mutations that should be deadly, but that show up in the healthy adult in front of you. Every person carries a set of mutations unique to them. What then is normal? Genetic testing is a medical service. It's used to enforce the boundaries of normal by screening out the anomalous. But seeing all the anomalies that are compatible with life might actually expand our understanding of normal. One father says, we need more kinds of normal. Another father said, that's a good thing when people show up in our lives, as his daughter, Sally, with Down syndrome did 6 years ago. And they are just normal in a totally different way. Everybody you meet is a little bit different but normal. And they all bear the image of God. And I think that means dignity for all people is a public good. I think it also means that these bodies God gave us require us to care for them, and caring for the body is a personal good. In a recent book, Timothy Tennant wrote A Theology of the Body, how we understand God's view of the body. Guess what? It's good. He made it that way. Guess what? It's pointing us toward the resurrection. And guess what? We should take care of it. Care for the body. We typically fail to realize the sacredness of the body because it seems to come to us in such a lowly, ordinary fashion. And these days, people feel threatened by their body or other people's bodies. And so they say, man, I want to get that vaccine. I want to be the first one to get that vaccine because I want this body to be a little bit stronger. And that makes sense. That's one way to care for your body. One way to care for your body is to get a vaccine. One way to care for your body is to take medicine. One way to care for your body is to exercise. One way to care for your body is to get good sleep. Christians should love to sleep. Psalm 3 talks about, I laid down, God was in control. I woke up, I was refreshed. That psalmist cared for his body. Care for the body is a personal good. It is okay for you to care for your body. God gave it to you for you to care for it. And if you think about this, in church circles, we talk about how we practice spiritual disciplines as a way to have intimacy with God. A spiritual discipline could be something like prayer, fasting, worship. The list goes on. Every single spiritual discipline requires your body. You cannot have a spiritual discipline which allows you to relate to God without your body. Even silence is keeping your mouth quiet. It's a spiritual discipline. Caring for your body helps you experience intimacy with God. So we practice spiritual disciplines. And intimacy with God is the highest good. See, God intends good for every image bearer. So yeah, we're all image bearers, and that means dignity for all people. That's a public good. Care for my body, that's my personal good. But intimacy with God is the highest good. Ultimately, why do people matter? This author asks. It's because we have, image bearers, a special connection with God and are intended to be a meaningful reflection of God. They have dignity and destiny of those made in the image of God. Intimacy with God is our highest good. And how did God say, I want to make sure you have that? He conceived Jesus in the womb of Mary. Jesus came to us, God came to us in a body, bearing the image of God, saying, I am with you, saying, I love you, saying, you are fearfully and wonderfully made, and I made you. God intends good for every image bearer. The psalmist got that. Let me pray that we do, and then we'll have a few songs we play up here. Father, I thank you that you have made us fearfully and wonderfully. Help us care for our bodies this week. Help us show dignity to people who are different from us this week. Help us see the image of God in all people, but not be afraid to call all people to intimacy with you, because that is the highest good. We know you took the first step. You had the Advent plan to come rescue us. Jesus, our Emmanuel, God with us, who bore our sins on his body, whom you raised in a resurrected body. And now we live as the body of Christ. Help us do that well. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.